Hi, I'm Barrett Nelson from On the Trail Creations in Fairbanks, Alaska. And this video is what I call the best tip ever. I didn't come up with it. I think it originally came from Bonnie Hunter, who's a well-known quilter and teacher. But I, of course, had to add my own little twist to it. So the basic concept is leaders and enders, or chain piecing. Also, they're kind of related. And it's a way to save a ton of time, a ton of thread, and a ton of aggravation. And a ton of bobbin winding. So that's not a small thing either. So stay tuned and I will show you how to save all of those things. If you've been sewing for a while, you probably already know to hang on to your threads is put your finger on your threads for the first couple of stitches when you start sewing, so they don't get pulled into the machine. And then normally when you get to the end of your seam, you pull it out and you have to leave a big tail there, and you have a big tail here to cut off. And if you look in this case, the tail that we're cutting off is much longer than the seam we even just stitched. So we would be wasting more thread than we're actually using. And that goes for bobbin winding also. That means you have to wind your bobbin more than twice as more often. So that's the beauty of chain piecing. You just, when you get to the end of your seam, then you just immediately put another one in there and don't cut it at all. So that's chain piecing. Saves a ton of thread. You probably are already familiar with that concept. And then you can cut them apart, and there's no wasted thread at all except for the very first seam. But eventually you're going to run out, right? I could go press these and get my next step ready, and so sometimes you can do that. You can just keep doing the next step or whatever and keep going, but eventually you will still run out. So that's when the concept of leaders and enders comes in, and you can just grab a scrap and stitch onto that. Always at least 2 layers, because it's hard for a sewing machine to sew on just one layer, so I always fold it in half at least. And then you can get your last one out and go press those and whatever. So I'm pretty sure, as far as I know, it was quilter Bonnie Hunter that came up with that concept, and you can have a couple of them, so one for the end and whatever, beginning, and then when you get to the end of your next batch, have another one handy, or you can reach around and cut off this one and put it back in the front. That's what I usually end up doing. So brilliant idea that saves a ton of aggravation and thread and unthreading of needles and all kinds of stuff. So great idea. Then she took it a step further and said, if you're doing that, why don't you keep a box of light squares and dark squares and just sew 2 of those together? Instead of using a scrap, just sew a pair of, a light and dark square together, or whatever. You can plan almost any quilt design you want and do it in between your other project as a leaders and enders project. So I've got a couple here that I've already pressed, and so I might have a whole box of light and dark, and I have those all, eventually those will be all stitched together. So then after that, then you'll just take a pair of those and use that for a leader and ender. Match up your seams and then just stick that in at the end of whatever you're doing. So at the end of that box, you're going to have a whole bunch of little 4 patches, and you can put those into something or whatever. And so that's a great idea too. I've made a couple of whole projects that way, just having a box of things ready to go that I sew together in between as my leaders and enders in between other seams. So that's also a great idea. However, it does take a little bit of prep work. So I've figured out a way to avoid that. If you're like me and you tend to sew more spontaneously and aren't into all the prep work, or just don't remember to do it, that's more like it with me. I found a way to avoid it. So my idea there is I will just grab a whole bunch of scraps that are coordinated. You can do that as carefully as you want and just do some improv piecing. So what that means is, let's see, I'll just look for That one's very shreddy. Lots of them are. That's okay, actually. It doesn't matter. I'll look for some that are close to the same size, and I will just sew those together. So that'll be one of my beginners and enders. And then when I need another one, I'll just grab some more scraps. And they sometimes can end up being bigger than just a little scrap, but that's okay too. There's a couple. They don't match up at all. The edges aren't perfectly straight. As long as I sew pretty straight, that's okay. So I'm gonna run out here, so I'll just cut that off. So eventually I'll have a pile of those. So then I'll go trim them and press them. I'll just finger press for now. And then next time maybe I'll stitch one in the other direction. And this time I'm trying to make it at a right angle. You can go trim and square it up and all that if you want. I generally don't. It depends. Eventually I will do more of that. But anyway, this is a way to do just some improv piecing as a beginners and enders project. So you can actually press, and you can go trim and square things up if you want, or maybe cut this one in half and use it and attach it to two different things. So then that's just a way of doing, you know, a project using the beginners and enders concept, but without so much prep work. And as long as you choose fabrics that are pretty well coordinated and you don't sew the same two fabrics to each other, then you're going to end up with something that looks okay. And in a minute I will show you some things that you can do with those. Okay, so that was how the concept works. Chain piecing, as long as you have things in your project to keep adding into your sewing machine, and then sewing onto a scrap or some pre-prepared squares or rectangles, whatever it is. You can do pretty much any quilt design using that concept. Or you can, to avoid some of the prep work, you can do some improv piecing, and that's my favorite because then I don't have to plan ahead. I did forget a couple of things. One, I forgot to show you my little 4-patch that came out of there, and so, you know, making a whole bunch of those would just be a really good start to another quilt. And then the other thing I didn't mention is there's a couple times that this doesn't work. One of them is when you need to change thread colors. So a lot of times for piecing, people will just use kind of a generic gray or whatever, and it often doesn't really matter that much, and especially for the improv piecing. So if you're super fussy about your thread color, then this isn't going to work for you. But I'm really not. I use whatever's on the machine unless it's for sure going to show. Most of the time. And then the other time it doesn't work is if you need to start sewing in the middle of something. If you're not sewing a seam, you know, from the end, if you're free motion quilting or whatever, then you'll have to take your little scrap out of the machine. But if I do change thread colors, I've been known to put a scrap under the machine and sew onto that before I even start sewing. And then my extra tail will be on that and not on my project, and I still don't have to worry about possible thread tangles or anything like that. So it's a great tip. And here are a couple of things. When I do the improv piecing, I often will make borders. Like I'll just keep adding pieces until they're a little bit wider than I want my border to be, and then I'll trim it after. Let's see if I can show you more of this. This is a panel by Teresa Asconi, a fireweed panel, which should be available on my website. I haven't quilted this one yet. But here's one that I did. Similar one that's an iris instead. But these just little improv borders are a great way to do a quick panel project. Or they're also great for journal covers or pot holders, and you can also do a whole entire quilt that way. I've done lap quilts too, and almost anything that's just plain piecing you can do as a project in between seams on your other project. So super cool tip that I hope you will try.